Over the last decade, Donald Trump has been compared to Adolf Hitler countless times. While Hitler is responsible for over 6 million deaths, many oppose likening these two as ludicrous and unreasonable. What would cause someone, let alone swarms of people, to relate a businessman turned president to one of history's most infamous fascist dictators? When these two are compared, emotions can run high, and for valid reason. Therefore, it will be more productive to inspect the concept of fascism itself than to hold Trump and Hitler side by side. What are the markers of fascism? In what ways did Nazi Germany end itself with fascism? And is America staring down its barrel? Many scholars have compiled characteristics of what defines fascism. In order to illustrate the most cohesive picture possible, it's necessary to comprise our own list from the existing data. 1. The nation is painted in a state of decline and victimhood, humiliated by their enemies. 2. These enemies are centered in larger-than-life myths, simultaneously weaker than the superior nationalists, and yet strong enough to erode the foundations of their society. 3. One charismatic leader presents himself to fearful citizens as the savior from their enemies who will restore their country. 4. Media and academia are villainized and suppressed into conforming to the new authoritarian order. 5. Differences in race, gender, sexuality, political opinion, and physical ability must be eradicated. In the aftermath of World War I, Germans felt defeated, depleted, and economically unstable. In the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans were ordered to pay 6.6 billion euros in reparations for starting the war, a whopping 280 billion euros accounting for modern inflation. The Germans were told to work more, but working harder and harder had no impact on their day-to-day lives. The people were working themselves to exhaustion, with nothing to show for it. The loss and uncertainty many Germans felt following the Great War perfectly set the scene for a smooth-talking authoritarian figurehead to be exalted. Adolf Hitler presents himself as the sole savior of Germany, capable of restoring it to its former glory. He captivates crowds, not with logic or reason, but with simple solutions for Germany's complex problems. He laid the groundwork with two myths, the myth of August 1914 and the myth of November 1918. August 1914 represents a time of German unity, power, and affluence. November 1918 is a symbol of German defeat at the hands of the enemy within, namely the Jews and the Socialists. Hitler reduced the cause of the war and Germany's current problems to these November criminals. The one and only way to restore Germany to her former glory is to drive out these treasonists and bring back the pre-war life. There was another myth at the heart of German unrest and unease. The rural myth, as Shelley Baranowski coined it, promoted the idea that rural living is the highest form of German living. Farming was thus viewed as the most admirable and patriotic work in all of Germany. There were, of course, still disproportionate levels of power and money at the top of agrarian social circles. Landlords had much more power and influence than land workers. Rural villagers were able to look past these discrepancies in the caste system, however, due to a sense of community and camaraderie fostered in the countryside. Villagers viewed city dwellers as overly Americanized and morally bankrupt, especially on views regarding gender and sexuality. The urbanites were not nearly religious enough, and most upsettingly, not Protestant enough. The city of Berlin was viewed as the epicenter of all modern German depravity. Conservative journalist Wilhelm Stapel said that Berlin had an embarrassing mixture of too many Slavs and Eastern European Jewish immigrants. These immigrants and Berlin intellectuals were polluting the countryside with their filth. The only cure for Berlin was conforming to Christian conservative society. Criticisms of Berlin from church-going villagers mainly surrounded sexual and gender norms. Focusing on these topics was not only because of puritanical prudishness. To German Protestants, a male-centered family was the backbone of the entire social order. It was right and good for fathers to rule over familial, political, and economic decisions. With this system in place, any subversion of it was a direct and imminent threat to the collective structure. Many Berliners looked down upon the backwards and outdated ways of life touted by the country folk. The rural populace generally supported German nationalism, power, social elitism, manliness, racism, and misogyny. They esteemed the countryside while disavowing the city. Those who held nationalistic views were opponents of democracy, liberalism, and socialism. Above all, they were anti-Semitic. It was the view of the nationalistic right that Jewish immigrants had infiltrated their once powerful society and conspired to drain the life of it for their own gain. Once the general public had been propagandized with this worldview, politicians could disparage the Jews without ever once mentioning Judaism. Whenever Hitler denigrated international finance spiders or asserted that international high finance had taken over Germany, his listeners knew exactly what he meant. It's important to note which demographics of Germans voted for the Nazi Party. The primary Nazi electorate was made up of working-class Protestants in the country and middle-class Protestants in the city. Protestants had good reason to distrust the post-war Weimar Republic of Germany. Their worldview centered on a perspective of humanity as wholly depraved. Much like the need for an authoritarian god or church order, they valued a totalitarian government to guide and punish wayward subjects. A state such as this could be considered a means of fulfilling God's will on earth. To oppose the government, then, would mean to oppose God. Middle-class Germans were not simply those who earned enough to make a comfortable living and retire in prosperity. These Germans were typically born into the middle class and worked for themselves in some manner, such as doctors and lawyers. Those in the middle class feared reducing their quality of life to that of the working class. Germany followed a similar pattern seen all across Europe in this way. Fascism took root and grew in countries where the socialists had grown large enough to intimidate the middle class. Fascism is a defensive reaction against the political left by those who have the most to lose. Following the Age of Enlightenment, there was a push against rationality, toleration, and all that the Enlightenment represented. This push toward irrationality perfectly paved the way for Hitler's propaganda to take root in German minds. Similarly, vicious rumors were circling Central and Eastern Europe. Accusations of ritual murder. The accused were Jews, baking Passover matzah. The alleged victims were Christian children, whose blood was a crucial ingredient in this holiday cuisine. The tragedy of the Great War was a primary propeller toward absurdist thought. The entirety of the war was senseless. No country gained more in the spoils of war than it lost in the casualties. In every country, ideas of enmity with each other and hostility were propagated. The Nazi vision of race as the answer to every conceivable problem was fertilized in the irrationality before and the violence of World War I. Nazi views were not unopposed, however. The free press of the German Weimar Republic unrelentingly pointed out Nazi lies, inconsistencies, and the impossibilities of their promises. As journalist and German law student Peter Drucker pinpointed, nobody would have been a Nazi if rational belief in the Nazi promises had been a prerequisite. While listening to a Nazi rally speaker, Drucker encountered what he surmised to be the best explanation of Nazism. We don't want lower bread prices. We don't want higher bread prices. We want National Socialist bread prices. Historians have observed a pattern suggesting that people form their voting habits not solely on policy, but on their surrounding influences. This explains why people will vote not in their best interest and without regard for their own safety. Their family, friends, churches, media, and other social structures heavily impact whether or not and how they vote. This phenomenon is called political confessionalization. Once people are influenced by political confessionalization, they rarely change their views. Adolf Hitler lied constantly to his cult of followers, while simultaneously being glaringly transparent about his beliefs and plans for the German people. A German journalist and author of Hitler's earliest biography, Konrad Hayden, wrote about the constant conviction of Hitler's speaking style. Whether telling the truth or a lie, he flooded the listener with an assurance that made their fears feel seen and taken care of. In his book, Mein Kampf, Hitler wrote that the less honest a political message is, the better. The larger the lie, the more likely that people will believe it. He regarded the general public as too stupid to create large and complex webs of lies, and would thus fail to suspect others of doing so. Hitler speculated that typical citizens, even once presented with the truth, would continue to adhere to the nature of the lies they preferred. While espousing nationalism and building up the German nation and people, Hitler viewed them with nothing but disdain. Judging them lazy and cowardly, he felt no need to speak to German citizens about policies like tariffs or foreign treaties. Worrying about explaining such concepts to commoners was the concern of liberal politicians. A simple and emotional message was needed to win the hearts and minds of the feeble-minded public. With this, he had his blueprint: a simple message, encoded in hatred, repeated continuously. It didn't all begin at once. There was a steady increase to Nazi tyranny. May 1st, 1929, known now as Blood May, was an outpouring of police brutality on peaceful Germans. Police officers both despised and feared areas like Neukölln and Wedding. They viewed them as cesspools of criminals and communists, not frequently drawing distinctions between the two. Berlin's reporter for the Chicago Daily News collected comments from police officers that day. "We would like to smoke out the whole nest. We would like to go about it differently, but we are not allowed to." It has long been speculated who exactly started the Reichstag fires. Whether or not it was Nazi leaders in an attempt to gain control over the public, that's exactly how it was used after the fact. On February 28, 1933, one day after the fires, the Reichstag fire decree came down from Hitler's cabinet. It suspended civil liberties that had been outlined in the German Constitution. The decree legalized the imprisonment of anyone the regime wished without trial, in effect abolishing the freedom of speech, assembly, confidentiality of communication, and freedom from warrantless searches. Following the fires, waves of arrests were made. Lena Haig was a longtime Communist Party activist who met her husband Alfred in the Communist Party youth group. The very same day the decree was issued, two men in trench coats and gray hats appeared at her door. She later explains, "They see that lunch is on the stove, that I have a child, that I can't just drop everything." The officers pass her child along to a neighbor and throw Lena her coat. They had previously arrested her husband, but not before beating him in the street. Lena stays in prison until the Christmas amnesty, while Alfred suffered a worse fate. Once, after refusing to salute the Nazi flag, guards beat him to near unconsciousness. The Nazis called this time of increased violence with decreased consequences the National Rising. They had long been planning to use force and oppression in their mission for autocracy. The militia police force known as the Stormtroopers and the violence they caused was a key component in consolidating power. In March 1933, the Nazis announced their first concentration camp with great fervor and jubilance. The term concentration camp came from the Russian Civil War. The first camp was in Dachau, outside of Munich. More camps quickly sprang, converted from penitentiaries, fortresses, and even breweries. The first wave of victims funneled into these camps were political dissenters. Primarily liberal, democratic, pacifist, communist, and socialist politicians, writers, lawyers, and activists. The Germans who fought most passionately for the rights of the disenfranchised often ended up being the ones most hardened toward democracy by the end of the Third Reich. It was, after all, democracy that allowed so many Nazis to claim seats of power. Prussian Prime Minister Otto Braun, however, suggested the idea that democracy was not what failed Germany. The failure, however, was the result of a large portion of the German population who had not risen to the sudden level of responsibility at hand. When voting for the Nazi Party causing active harm to others was likely not at the top of voters' most valued outcomes. Business executives desired weakened unions, the military wanted more weapons, and farmers wanted more sales for their crops. All these three groups were able to point to a primary source of frustration: Germany's new position in the world after the war. Few voters wanted a barbaric regime. They simply viewed the Nazi Party as the fastest and easiest way to get what they specifically wanted. The Nazi Party proved to be the most effective at capturing the bitterness that downtrodden Germans felt. After 1929, Germans with anti-democratic, anti-socialist views had no party but the Nazi Party they felt that they could cast a vote for. Conservative politicians thus, at one point or another, had to find ways to work with or use Hitler, lest they give up their careers. The Night of the Long Knives was the bloody end of the conservative establishment's relationship with Hitler. The downfall of German democracy was the result of individuals seeking self-interest, a culture that valued irrationality and myth-making, and an extremist protest on left-wing ideology. Very few Germans could ever imagine what would become reality, but their ignorance wouldn't save them. Those of us born after World War II have the gift of hindsight, and with that gift comes a greater responsibility. When parallels are drawn between Donald Trump and Adolf Hitler, they're not done so to besmirch or disparage Trump. These comparisons are made out of fear of what could be and what has been when power is left unchecked. Americans are not doomed to repeat history, but that's exactly what they're currently doing. If we can witness and understand the parallels of how we got here, it may be enough to inspire a different outcome. Following the elections of 2008, the Republican Party in the United States was decimated. They lost the presidency and had a minority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. In 2008, the United States also faced one of the largest economic recessions in its history. Americans were losing their homes to foreclosure, their jobs to layoffs, and their hope for the future. After losing numbers in 2008, the GOP was determined to turn it around in the 2010 midterms. Republicans focused heavily on immigration reform at this time in hopes of securing the votes of a growing Hispanic population. When Donald Trump entered the political arena, however, everything changed. He was largely focused on defaming migrants and building support around claims that they were the cause of increased unemployment and crime rates. America has been a religiously puritanical nation from its inception. The U.S. promotes itself as a Christian nation, built on a foundation of the Protestant work ethic and the nuclear family. The Mormon Church in America plays a unique role in this push toward simplified life. Mormon influencers promote traditional gender roles and purity of life. Focuses on purity in food, purity from modern living, or purity in gender and sexuality are easy entry points into fascist ideology. That may sound eager to jump to conclusions, but fascism follows a clear pattern. Whenever people start to believe that there is one right or pure way to live, it's a slippery slope to believing that you're better than someone else, with or without realizing it. Conservative Americans have deemed California as the heart of all American perversion and evil. Liberalism, the arts, lack of religion, and high population of migrants. If the evangelical Christians could implement their religious beliefs on a state or even federal level, these hellbound Californians may stand a chance against the liberal agenda. Until then, however, it was determined to be an act of God when tragedy struck highly democratic areas. The woke agenda was a danger to children and Americans in general. If there weren't so many migrants, if there weren't so many trans or gay people, if there were more Christians, then California would be worthy of support. Liberal Americans don't exactly tend to have an empathetic view of conservatives either. Many Democratic Americans view Republicans as bigoted, backward, and uneducated, often viewing tragedy and self-imposed oppression as righteous and deserved. Modern Republicans are anti-woman, anti-LGBTQ+, anti-abortion, and anti-intellectual. Liberals largely feel justified in desiring wrath to fall on conservatives because of their tendencies toward self-interest and disregard for others. The people who voted for Donald Trump are mostly comprised of those who felt disenfranchised as a result of civil rights. Since women and people of color were now allowed to do things once reserved for only one demographic, white men began to feel oppressed. In days past, white men were able to speak freely, no matter who they affected. Men were not expected to contribute much to daily life, but were needed by women to have things like a home or a bank account. In modern times, the nuclear family is obsolete. If women didn't need to get married, if women could marry each other, that would give men less power. White people losing the upper hand in the job and housing markets felt singled out. Men and women who spent their entire lives assimilating into the gender roles of the nuclear family felt rattled by what it could mean if those gender roles weren't natural, but socially constructed. In response to increasing intellectualization, conservatives have waded into absurdist philosophy in an attempt to overcorrect. Abortion is no longer a fringe or solely Catholic issue. Pro-life convictions are now central to American evangelicalism. Homosexuality and transgenderism are not just ways people may want to live their lives, but ways that people want you to live your life. In the midst of a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, wearing a mask to protect yourself and others is an infringement on your personal freedoms. Life-saving vaccines are unnecessary and cause neurological diseases and disorders. Immigrants are not fellow people seeking a better life in the same way many Americans or their ancestors did. Immigrants are dangerous criminals sucking the life from the economy and government resources. Before Donald Trump was elected to serve his second term as president, he famously promised his constituents that he would be a dictator on day one. Scorned by political opponents in his first term, he was out for vengeance against those who tried to bring him down. Conservative politicians who had previously spoken against Trump and the MAGA movement, like J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, could see the path that opposing Donald Trump would lead down. Being a Republican since 2016 has largely meant supporting Trump and his MAGA ideology. Whether they were advised or came to this realization on their own, Republicans at large would need to get behind Donald Trump and his agenda in order to be successful conservative politicians. Almost as soon as Donald Trump took office, the deportations began. Promising to only take the worst of the worst and the most violent criminals, his administration quickly broke that promise. The Department of Homeland Security openly admits on their website that only almost 75% of those detained are convicted or even accused of crimes. These so-called deportations aren't transporting migrants to the countries from which they came. These individuals are being taken off the street and out of their homes without warrants in many cases and being sent to the notorious CCOT prison facility or terrorism confinement center in El Salvador. Individuals not convicted or even accused of terrorism are currently being held in a concentration camp. Using that word alone may cause many to feel heightened emotions, and rightfully so. The darkest stain on history isn't something to be made light of, but this isn't an exaggeration or even a likening of the two. These facilities fit the exact definition of a concentration camp. The Human Rights Watch organization has been investigating the facility for crimes against humanity. Many Americans still feel safe in their immigration, religious, marital, or financial status, even their skin color. This sense of safety, however, isn't founded in the reality that they face. From immigration lawyers in Massachusetts to California nonprofit workers, born American citizens have received notices to leave the country or risk deportation. People traveling to and from the United States are being harassed and detained. America is surely no longer the beacon of freedom it once believed itself to be. Taking all of this into account and much more left unsaid, striking parallels can be drawn between Hitler's Germany and Trump's America. A frightening future lies before the United States. Will those in power continue to follow in the footsteps of history's most despised war criminals? Will the American people continue to follow in the footsteps of Germans who wanted to rid their country of Jewish filth? It can be argued that modern U.S. citizens hold an even higher level of responsibility than Germans under the Third Reich. Most Germans didn't even know about the death camps until they were liberated by military forces in 1945. Americans have known about the plans to use CCOT and Gitmo the entire time. Of course, a majority have protested, but still a large percentage are content with or even intent on the use of a terrorism confinement center known for human rights violations. To these people, It is never too late to change your ways when presented with new information. Any American who has continuously supported Donald Trump and his agenda will not be ridiculed for changing their stance. There have been many last straws for MAGA supporters. Each individual must decide what theirs will be. Do not let moral wrongdoings be twisted into justice. If the line isn't drawn at the extermination of others, who will be there to stop it when you become the next target? Each and every citizen must decide exactly when it's gone too far and what they must do next.